Hey guys, welcome back to Eddiefied, where we have real conversations that encourage believers towards love and good works. Today's guest is someone who lives out his faith in one of the most complex and misunderstood arenas, government. Sam Chung, and I'm just going to read it off because I don't want to mess it up. He's the Senior Vice President of Government Relations and External Affairs in California Life Sciences. He's got nearly 20 years of experience in advocacy, strategy, and public service. And Sam has advised state lawmakers, built teams, shaped policies, and has been in the center of some of the most complicated political and policy spaces in our state.
That's a nice bio. Whoever wrote that. Yeah.
I might have missed some, so forgive me if I did.
No, you're good.
More than that, he's a brother in Christ who's had to walk out his faith in an environment where conviction is tested every day. We're going to talk about what it means to follow Christ in public life, how believers can engage politics without losing humility, and how faith informs integrity when the pressure's high. And finally, we'll touch on how Christian nationalism should look like from a biblical perspective. And so our hope today is that this conversation strengthens, encourages, and reminds you that God can use believers in every sphere, including politics. Sam, thank you so much for being here, brother.
Thanks for having me.
I got to say, your background when I was doing the research is very impressive, and you've walked an incredible path. And I'm sure the Lord's not done with you yet.
No, even close.
Not even close. But every journey has a starting point. And long before, job titles and leadership roles, what was your childhood like? And if you don't mind, take us into some of the family values, the faith, the culture, and maybe even some early lessons that shaped your view of personal responsibility or service.
My parents immigrated from Korea when they're in their 30s, and so had a very Korean cultural in-home experience. So I had to very quickly mature and figure out how I'm going to take care of my parents living in a country that they are not familiar with. They don't know the system, and so they couldn't give me much advice. So I spent a lot of my time learning from others, mimicking what other people did around me. And there's both good and bad that comes from that. But I do think overall it did expedite the learning curve for me. And one of the big things that I had to develop quickly is certain skills and abilities so that I can either keep up with others or to navigate a path that would be good for my potential career down the line. And so one of the big things that I latched onto early was communication skills and writing skills.
How early, if you don't mind?
So this is I started really focusing in on it when towards the end of high school, early college. That's when I really started to take a deeper look. And I was always intrigued by people who are great storytellers. There are people where in a group setting, for whatever reason, they can capture the attention of everybody. Yeah. Somebody else may be telling a similar story, but for some reason they can't capture the attention of everybody that's around them. And so I was always watching and mimicking what other people were doing well. And then I quickly figured out that communication, writing skill, that is something that came more naturally to me. And so I didn't have necessarily a desire to go into politics or go into government or anything like that, but I continued to hone those skills. And I think being able to toggle between both cultures, both in the home, outside the home, taking care of my parents, trying to always anticipate their needs and kind of looking ahead, I think that has been very formative for me. My mom was a believer. My dad is not a believer, and he still isn't. But my mom was force, an absolute force when it came to sticking the Bible on me, dragging me to church. And, a lot of times, I understood things intellectually, but it never bore any fruit in my life. But it's amazing how all those seeds get planted. And then when I did come to faith later in college, that's when a lot of what my mom had instilled in me started blossoming. And so that was a very important part of my life.
Could you expand a little bit on that moment to where Christ revealed himself to you through the gospel? What led up to that?
I was, a little bit of a troublemaker early on in college. I was very easily influenced by those around me, people who loved the fun zone, and I loved participating in the fun zone. But my mom, she primarily went to a charismatic church, but through some context, she finally went to a Bible teaching church, and she told the pastor of that church, hey, my son is off in college. He's at UC Davis. He will come back to LA where I'm from during the holidays. Can you meet up with him for dinner? Like, he needs to hear the gospel. He's drifting away. So this pastor met up with me for dinner, and he just asked a simple question. He asked, if you're to die right now, would you go to heaven or hell? And I didn't really understand where that question was coming from, but, I told him, yeah, I think I'll go to heaven. And I kind of gave, responses that clearly did not sit well with them. I told them, hey, I'm not a bad person. I try to do the right things, that typical answer. And he said, based on that answer, you will go to hell. And that shocked me. And nobody has ever talked to me that way and just told me that I was straight up going to hell. And then he gave the explanation why. No acknowledgement of sin, which means you don't understand your condition and why Jesus has died for you. And so he just planted that seed with me, but I couldn't shake it. I went eventually back to UC Davis, went into my dorm, and I just couldn't stop thinking about the possibility that, hey, I don't know where I'm going to end up for eternity. And so that fear started the process where he sent me some books, he sent me some sermons by John MacArthur, and that started the process. I was listening to John MacArthur's sermons. It opened my eyes. I was like, how come I never heard the gospel or the Bible being preached and teached this way? And so that really started the journey, and I couldn't stop. I was reading the Bible, listening to the sermons, and then I was looking for, how do I get in front of this John MacArthur guy? How do I listen to more of his sermons in the flesh? And then so there was a Resolve conference. It was the first year that Resolve started.
2005?
Yeah. That was my first time seeing John MacArthur in person. And I went through all the emotions during that conference. I was in tears, and that really started the process. And then from there, I knew that I wanted to go to a Bible teaching church back when I got back to Davis. And so at this conference, I just happened to sit next to two people who went to a church in Sacramento, a Bible teaching church. And so that's how I started. As a UC Davis student, I started going to this church, River City Grace, when I was just a sophomore in college. And I was the first college student to go to this church. But yeah, so that started my journey. I can't recall a specific day, but I definitely know the sequencing of events that really got my curiosity going, and then eventually conviction, and then repentance. Like those things definitely did happen in a certain season in my life. I can't pinpoint an exact date or time, but even then, when you do get exposed to this teaching, one of I think the temptations is to become judgmental. Yeah. And I definitely struggled with that. It was hard for me I used that Bible teaching and that great teaching as almost a weapon for judgment to those around me, to those who I didn't think were going to have solid churches. Yeah. I wielded it as a weapon. And so I was humbled very, very quickly as I started stumbling and getting into certain sins. That lofty way I viewed myself, it all got flipped, and my pride just got so exposed through that experience. And there's a lot of humbling very soon after.
I can so relate with that, because I think that's an issue that a lot of young believers have that are exposed to this, reformed, just solid doctrine, and where you are almost like you're wielding the word, but without love, right? It's like, yeah, you're saying the right thing, and you're just so on fire, like, yeah, I'm right, you're wrong, but you're not doing it out of love. And so you're not winning anybody over to the Lord, right? But anyway, since your college journey coming to the Lord, you spent nearly 2 decades in strategy, advocacy, and communication. What initially drew you to that kind of work? Was it during college? Was it after? Please share.
Yeah, so in college, I was studying journalism, and I wanted to pursue a career in journalism. And so I went through a program through the Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. And my first gig at a journalism school was covering politics in Sacramento. And so that's how I got exposed for the first time to the state capitol and everything that was happening within the building. And from there, I quickly realized I'd rather be on the inside than on the outside looking in and writing about it. And so for me, that became crystal clear. as much as I love journalism, as I was covering and talking to different elected officials, I really wanted to be on the inside. And so I had built up some contacts, and some folks recommended me to certain people. And I eventually started in the Capitol at the lowest level. I started as an intern, and I was just like anyone who'd be willing to offer me a job.
How old were you?
This is pretty soon after college, so probably 21 or 22, yeah, around there. And it was just the right fit. I happened to get into the right legislator's office. I started as an intern and then a scheduler, but I was doing all the grunt work, but I was happy to do it. I just wanted to be in the arena where all this was happening. And I think as I was in those roles, I was able to observe and watch more people. I was able to watch other lobbyists, other legislative staffers, elected officials, and just seeing how they argued their points, how they communicated with such impact. And so as a young person, I was just absorbing all of that, and I was obsessed with how do I improve my own communication skills so that I can be like these guys that I was observing, who are high-powered, influential, the way they carried themselves, and I was just fascinated. And so that started my journey, and spent a lot of time, studying different policy issues so that I can be more and more useful to the different elected officials that I work for. And so I rose up very quickly. I was given opportunities that I don't think was given to everybody, so I was very fortunate. And with that trust that was given to me by different elected officials, I quickly rose up the ranks.
I want to dive a little deeper in talking about those, open doors as you grew in your political career. When you look back, how do you see God's providence in opening those doors, even in seasons when you didn't fully understand where you were or the specific political direction maybe that you were called to serve in?
Yeah, I mean, ever since college, because I didn't have my parents telling me what to believe, especially when it came to politics, Republicans versus Democrats. My parents never talked about it, nor did they ever really care. But then, so I explored a lot of that on my own. So I was listening to a lot of, I was reading books, I was watching different talking heads on different news programs. And then, so I started developing my own views and beliefs and things that I think make this country a great country to live in. And then, so I was constantly a student of different political ideologies, and then I combined that with certain natural skills when it comes to writing, communicating. And I think those two things really helped build skill sets that were valuable for different elected officials. And so I was able to figure out how to look at polling, how to look at different trends in different communities, and be able to communicate to my bosses at the time, hey, this is where I think you should be, how you should position yourself on an issue, how you should message it. And so those things came pretty natural to me, being able to identify trends and learning how to best communicate it. And then teeing up opportunities for my boss, whoever the elected official was, to take advantage of certain opportunities. And so that helped me earn a lot of trust with these elected officials. And then that put me in positions where I could work for elected officials who were in very difficult re-elections. And so they would usually helicopter me in to be chief of staff for an elected official who's in a tight race, and I would have to build up their political operations, their policy operations, their campaign operations very quickly. And not too many people have both sides of that brain where they can, do the policy, but also understand the politics and be able to marry those two things together to help the elected official be successful.
And I recognize that as believers and, as people, there's the personal responsibility of just pure grit, diligence, discipline that you probably had to exercise, and just growing in those different skills. Obviously, it took time, and people recognized you for that and gave you opportunities. But was there a moment or moments that you can come back to and say, wow, this is God just opening this door, and I feel that this is where he's calling me to go?
Yeah, I think everyone who I worked for really were great mentors. Every boss that I worked for, they helped me get my next roles. They gave me the opportunity to shine. And so I think just the path that I took through, especially the early stage of my career, was all God's providence and putting me with the right people who helped propel me through my career. And I may be in a completely different situation if I worked for a politician or elected who just didn't give me that opportunity or didn't give me that chance. But fortunately, I was able to work for the right people, and I was always surrounded by those who can help me get my next gig or give me the opportunity to shine in a certain way that was noticed by others.
It's awesome to hear, like what you said, you saw God's providence even from the very beginning, the early steps, and faithfulness over and on your journey. And that's what I see is one of the clearest examples of that is your transition into the chief of staff role. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. You know, a lot of people hear chief of staff and might have a certain perception just based on what we see in movies or on TV. So I want to ask, can you describe how God opened that door or led you to that role, and then pull back the curtain into what that role actually looked like day to day? What were you responsible for and who were you serving?
Yeah, as the chief of staff for any elected official, I mean, you're basically one of their closest advisors. So you know everything that they are concerned about, and you know what's in their mind, and you are trusted to build out a team and a game plan, both short-term and long-term, to help them achieve what they want to achieve. It may be a policy agenda, it may be getting reelected, or it may be positioning them for their next career jump. But your job as the chief of staff is to have such a good pulse on everything that is happening in the community that your boss represents. And so for me, I spent a lot of time really honing my instincts about, hey, the people in the community that this elected official represents, like what is it that they are looking for in their representative? And so being able to make sure my boss was in the right place at the right time to help message those things appropriately was key. Making sure the team was always ready to provide briefings and to help prep the elected official on how to vote in policy committee hearings, on the assembly floor, on the Senate floor. And so there's so many aspects of the operations, and it's my job to make sure everyone knew what they're doing, that there was a strategy that everybody was on board with and pushing towards, and making sure my boss, whoever the elected is getting what they need, and for us to be able to tee up the right opportunities for them. And so a lot of it is being their personal advisor, their professional advisor. You just kind of live and breathe like their career and understanding like what you need to set up for them so that they can achieve success. And it could be both political or from a policy perspective.
So just going back a little bit, how many years were you an intern before you got into the chief of staff role?
I was just an intern for 3 months. So
That's it?
Yeah, I was very fortunate. So somebody saw and they're like, hey, we'll pluck them out.
That's amazing. I mean, that's a God thing. There's one thing. That's
big
crazy.
Time. Big time.
And I can imagine how, you know, being a believer in that environment probably couldn't have been that easy, right? So was there ever a time you felt tension between political loyalty and spiritual conviction, and how did you handle it?
Yeah, there aren't too many times where there's a direct conflict between like personal values and the job. Most of what you're doing is helping the elected official understand what they're voting on, the pros and cons of what they're voting on. And so a lot of it is just helping the elected official have the information they need to make the best decision that they can, that will best help their community that they represent. And so usually there's no tension there. Now, there may be tension when it comes to like when people want to know how your boss is going to vote. There's like those types of opportunities where it's like sometimes
policies.
Yeah, you may know, but then you don't want to reveal it, and so sometimes you're doing that dance. But for the most part, I want to be upfront. I want to be very clear when I can. And there's a strategy behind everything. Sometimes you can't just like let everybody know right away. Sometimes you have to wait a little bit and you got to time it. But I think if you're building your reputation as somebody who is going to be upfront and honest, that is usually how you get out of bad situations where you're not trying to cover things up or you're giving, you know, half truths. And so for me, it was very important to build credibility in this community as somebody who is going to be honest with my boss and also honest with like other lobbyists who may want to know, hey, where does your boss stand on something? Or it may be a member of the community who wants to know where the boss stands. And so I always pushed my bosses to, hey, like, this is how you should defend your position on this. And so I would just be upfront with it. and then it's up to the elected official to convey it.
Yeah. But when you were initially getting into politics and pursuing that path, being a believer, did that change the way that you positioned yourself as far as who you wanted to work for and support?
Yeah, I mean, generally, there's Christian moral teachings and values that you want to make sure is aligned with whoever you're working for.
Yeah.
And I've worked for typically Republican elected officials. Actually, every elected official I've worked for are Republicans, and so on some of like the moral issues, like those are already set. Like we're already on the same page. But 99.9% of issues are dealing in non-moral issues. It's policy arguments. We may have different opinions or perspectives on how to achieve certain successes when it comes to, like if you want to improve the healthcare system, if you want to improve the housing, the affordability issue, there's different ways of getting there. And so usually the disagreements are around how to get or achieve a certain goal, but rarely are you in a situation where you're like, man, morally this is wrong, this is the wrong policy position, but I still have to support it anyway. Usually we're not in those types of positions, but you should usually be working for somebody where you're aligned on your moral, the black and white beliefs.
You should, absolutely. Speaking of integrity, right? In light of that, where your integrity and your moral compass is tested, it's often tested not just in the political sphere, but in any workspace, regardless. I don't care what it is, whether it's flipping burgers to whatever maybe. However, politics is obviously not the exception. Those tests happen there more often than in any other field. Maybe excluding lawyers, right? But, a funny example that I remember, you remember that men's breakfast that we had probably a couple of years ago? I actually invited a friend of mine to come to men's breakfast, and this guy was working for the sanitation department out in the Bay Area. And there was a question during the icebreaker that was asked, who has the dirtiest career?
Oh, yeah.
Do you remember that one?
I do remember that one.
And so we were sitting at different tables, and my buddy was sitting in our table, and we all voted him because he worked in the sanitation department. Yeah, care to explain what happened with your table? Like, how did they come to say that you had the dirtiest career?
They're like, this is a pharmaceutical lobbyist. I think they specifically said Pfizer lobbyist, and so they're like, this is clearly the dirtiest job.
It was still during COVID time, right?
Right.
Okay, so back on track. As a Christian, how did you use this position to be the salt and light without alienating people who disagree with you politically or spiritually?
Yeah, I think people generally know when you are a loving person, you're a caring person. And one of the big things that I really try to do is make sure I was able to connect with people on a more personal level as well. It wasn't just always all business. A lot of times, like I wanted to show compassion for people who are dealing with different things or struggling with different things. So much of it is how you carry yourself, how you show up, how you show care for others. And so a lot of what I did in the Capital community is like I tried to understand where somebody was coming from. And so I never wanted to see somebody that I disagreed with politically as the enemy. In fact, I always wanted to go out of my way to show, hey, I want to better understand where you're coming from. And I think being able to do that and convey that, people feel that and know that. And so this is kind of a weird thing, but at the Capitol, sometimes they have like a voting thing where you can vote for different peers in different categories. And so on the survey, like you could vote for, hey, who is a Republican staffer that you like to most work with. And so like I won that award one year.
Oh, that's awesome.
And so it's things like that where like you don't want to, because of certain philosophical disagreements, like start alienating people. And just being able to do that, I think, helped make myself more accessible, approachable from all different types of people across the political spectrum. And that has yielded great results. Like a lot of those who vehemently disagree with me will go to church, will visit church because they're curious. Like they're all humans at the end of the day, and they're going through different things, and they'll remember that I'm a believer, and they'll ask about my church life, my faith, and they'll want to come. Sometimes they hear the sermon and then they don't want to come anymore. But the fact that they know who to reach out to in those moments was huge. And some of those people I still remain very, very close with, even if they're politically on the opposite side of me.
Yeah, that's incredible. The fact that you have that kind of relationship, that's where you truly see the love that Christ had. He wasn't hanging out with the religious Pharisees, right? He was actually hanging out with everyday believers,
Hmm.
breaking bread. And so to see and hear you do that, I actually read a few articles about you that actually mentioned your name in their coming of faith in the political arena. Do you want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, this particular person, he is a political columnist for
Hmm.
various mainstream publications, and he's a very talented writer, very sharp political mind. And during COVID, when we're all locked away in our homes,
Yeah.
he started reaching out and asked about my faith. And I knew we had nothing but time because it was like at the very
Oh,
beginning
yeah.
stages of COVID. And
Yeah.
so I suggested a book that we read together, Reason for God. And we worked through that book together and we talked every day for several months. And eventually he came to faith. And that was such an
Wow.
encouragement to me. And even in his writing, and as you saw some of his op-eds, like he will be
Yeah.
very open about his faith, which
Yeah.
is a tough thing to do because as a political columnist, it's hard to write about things of faith. Like,
Oh, yeah. It
yeah,
would probably turn a lot of people away, right?
but he is proud of it and the conviction is
It's
real.
amazing.
And we are still very, very close to this day. So that's just an opportunity that God provided. And because we had a working relationship, like he remembered that I believe in Jesus, I love Jesus, and whatever he was going through in his life, it was the right time for him to hear it. And that's how that all came about. And he
Yeah.
still stays very faithful to this day.
That's amazing. And this is someone who didn't have a faith background, right? Just completely from the world, just coming to know the Lord. That's incredible. Fascinating story. It's incredible to see you being faithful in the little things, right? Just like not putting aside your faith while you're putting on your political hat, right? Or your chief of staff role hat. And then further down, we see that God opened a different kind of door, one that shifted you into a totally different arena, right? So I want to shift gears and talk about what prompted you to move from legislative leadership to representing the life sciences sector.
Yeah, so I'd been chief of staff for various elected officials for about 12, 13 years at that point. And it was one of those things where you just get a little restlessness where you're like, what else is out there? Can I be doing something similar in politics, but with a different hat on? And there are some government affairs folks for pharmaceutical companies that did reach out and wanted me to consider the current role that I'm in now to lead California Life Sciences, which is a trade association representing 1,300 different life sciences companies, pharmaceuticals, biotech, medical technology, academic research institutions. And it's a daunting role. It's a huge sector, second largest sector in California. So there is a lot on the line. The nature of the battles, policy battles this industry gets into has huge implications for such a big industry. And so they were looking for somebody with a certain disposition and skill set to lead them, someone who had the gravitas, who can understand the politics, understand the strategy, and to be able to get individuals to follow. And so that is most of what I'm doing, is looking at the landscape, putting together strategies, and then getting this industry to put their support behind the strategy so that we can have the outcome, the policy success that we're looking for. And so that's how I ended up transitioning into the role. And I didn't know in the beginning whether it was going to be the right fit, but I mean, God's sovereign, and
Yeah.
it feels like the perfect fit. Like it just came so naturally and built the trust with our membership, and really just enjoying the role over the last 4 years.
Yeah. Well, that puts things a little bit more in perspective as far as that shift from chief of staff to the current role you're in. But for those who might not understand what this role looks like, can you break it down for us? What does a chief lobbyist do? And what does a good day and a bad day look like?
Yeah, yeah. And so as a lobbyist, as a government affairs professional, I am trying to educate and influence the outcome of policies in California. So that is my number one job. And there's different ways to educate lawmakers. I mean, you can, set up meetings, go to their office, they'll give you 20 to 30 minutes to make your case either for a bill or oppose the bill. And so that's the bread and butter way of lobbying. But I pull together conferences, education forums, so that I'm inviting legislators, lawmakers to come to the conference or the forum so that they can hear from subject matter experts. They can hear from me, they can hear from others in our industry to help inform them about the consequences or unintended consequences of certain policies that they may be looking at in the near term. And so it's our job to help give them the best information and education possible so that they can make the best decision when they start voting on these pieces of legislation. And so I do my best to help influence the outcome that will deeply impact our companies and the companies that we represent at California Life Sciences. Okay. And so there's a lot of trust put into this organization to make sure we're softening the ground, providing the education so that enough legislators vote the way we want them to vote so that our companies can continue to thrive here in California.
Yeah, that's extremely interesting. And I know you kind of kept it at a 30,000 foot view, but if you could bring it down to maybe 10,000, right? And just talk about, let's say, for example, you have a policy that you're trying to push. What are the steps that you want to take to make sure that you set it up for success?
Maybe I can use an example. So, like a piece of policy that we would consider a big threat would be like legislation that bans animal testing in California. And we can see why that'd be popular. It's part of the FDA process in order for our drugs to, before it even gets to clinical trials on humans, we want to make sure we're testing it properly.
We don't want to test on humans, of course.
Correct. And so a lawmaker may introduce legislation to ban animal testing, and it's coming from a place of good intent. They're not trying to destroy our industry or anything like that, but they have a soft spot for animals. For us, that's an existential threat. We can't get drugs to market. We can't get cures to market without that critical step of animal testing. And so it's my job to help lawmakers understand why animal testing is necessary, because sometimes the argument will be like, well, use alternative forms of testing, use computer modeling, and maybe in the future with AI we'll get there, but we're not quite there yet. So until we get there and the FDA says, yes, you can use computer modeling as part of your application for this drug, like we need to use the methods that are currently available to us. And when it comes from a human health perspective, like we just can't stop the advancement of medicines that people depend upon. And so there's a lot, you have to weigh the pros and the cons. So it's my job to be as credible as possible, showing the pros and the cons, and why from our industry's perspective, banning animal testing will be devastating from a human health perspective. Once you kind of show that, like a lot of legislators will get it. They'll be like, oh, okay, I don't want that. And we try to show the nuance, like if you don't want animal testing for cosmetic products that are not like critical for life, then it's like, we can talk about that. Those are areas where we can agree to disagree. But when it comes to human health, it's like, hey, like this will have devastating, literally people's lives will be on the line if we don't have animal testing. So that's an example of an area where it's like, I have to make sure our lawmakers understand our industry's perspective. They don't just pass it thinking, oh, we're doing something great for animals.
Sam, I totally see why you're in this role. You are so good at like being sensitive to both sides. Just hearing your answer, I was like, wow, that is the definition of the term politically correct.
You got to be very diplomatic. Very sensitive to all interests.
You know, absolutely, man. That was good. That was, the way you phrased it was beautiful. I appreciate you bringing us into that world and the clarity on what that looks like from your vantage point. And now I want to shift into an area where Christians oftentimes struggle and wrestle with. How do you go about navigating through biblical convictions when it comes to, say, lobbying for controversial things like stem cell research development, where we know that in the past, more so in the past, they were taking it from aborted babies, fetuses. Can you please dive into that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Specifically when it comes to stem cell research, I mean, there's different types of stem cell research. Like when it comes to destroying embryos, like that's where like we would have more cause to pause. But so much with IVF, there's just a lot of now the stem cells, the way we extract it, that has nothing to do with embryos. And so there's some gray area there. But in general, there's always going to be good and bad in every industry. And in my role, we're not specifically advocating for stem cell research. We're advocating for the industry in general. We want good therapeutic research to be happening in the state of California so that we can deliver new cures and treatments to people. And so the vast majority of that research has nothing to do with stem cells. And so I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Like there's always going to be different aspects of every industry that you can point to that where you can say, hey, that might not be the best for humanity. But for the most part, I believe what the life sciences is doing in California is very important work that helps all of humanity around the globe. And so I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And for us, when we are educating people, our credibility is on the line. And so we do our best to provide the best information possible, both good and bad. There's no industry that's infallible. Like, for example, like there was a Black legislator who was very upset about some of our medical devices because like some of our forehead thermometers or like just didn't read with certain skin pigmentation, it was off. Like the reading was off on the forehead thermometer. Yeah. And from a Black lawmaker perspective, they saw that as discriminatory. They're like, how come this works on white people? It reads it accurately, but it goes on Black skin and it suddenly doesn't read it accurately. Yeah. Like, why is this product in the market? And so those are the types of things where it's like, hey, we need to go back and look at that. We need to make sure that it provides proper readings across the board. And that's like a relatively non-life-threatening, but there could be other devices where it could be life-threatening. And so we need to make sure like those things are accounted for, but it's not coming from a place of like, hey, we're purposely trying to.
Of course.
And so, but then we do need to be responsive to that. And people can point to that as an example of like, hey, like, your industry isn't doing that well, but it's like an area of improvement. But we have to acknowledge it. We have to say, hey, that is something that we can do better and make sure that we're better accounting for that and doing the proper tests to make sure it doesn't have those issues. So all that to say that we have to be very credible when it comes to the information that we're delivering. And if the lawmaker who's receiving the information believes, hey, they're doing their best and they're giving the best information they can, usually there's a lot more room for grace and ability to work out policies that are win-wins for both sides.
Right. Thanks for unpacking that. That's very interesting. And, these topics, the controversial ones, they get complicated, right? Sometimes spiritually, ethically, and oftentimes even structurally, because most people don't even know how, like me, right, how the healthcare system works or functions behind the scenes. And there's probably even some confusion behind who decides what in healthcare, like in your space. So when it comes to that, without getting into the weeds, at a high level, who does what as opposed to what you do versus, let's say, pushing a certain policy or drug or whatnot, researchers, FDA, physicians, insurers, PBMs, legislators. Can you please unpack that for us a little bit? Just, high level.
Yeah, the healthcare system is complicated and it's always going to be complicated in America. We have a very robust healthcare system that has a lot of different players in it. And one of the features of the American healthcare system is you do have health insurance companies, you do have providers. You're not just negotiating with government. You're negotiating with other private entities that play a critical role in providing coverage for certain drugs, reimbursement. And so it's a very complicated system. And so sometimes you can unfairly blame certain industries, but it's all being commingled in this healthcare system that makes it very hard for people to discern who is at fault, who is the cost driver. And so those are the types of things that we spend a lot of time educating policymakers on. And so when it comes to, prescription drugs is usually the thing that people like latch onto as like, hey, this is a problem.
Exactly.
But we educate lawmakers about, hey, this is the way we list our drug prices. We provide massive rebates and discounts to those drugs so that health insurance companies will cover them. But then the drug changes hands multiple times. And by the time it ends up at the pharmacy and somebody goes to pick up their medication, the price is 100x, 1,000x more than what we expect with our rebates to cost for the patient. But from the patient's perspective, when they pick up their drugs at the pharmacy, all they're seeing is our name on that pill on the container, and they think it's us that's jacking up the prices. And so it's a complicated system, and it's our job to make sure policymakers understand how it all works. So we've been able to have some wins in that area, being able to help discern like who is driving the cost of what. But it's a 24/7 job. Like the education just is constant, and people don't know how difficult it is in general, because people take it for granted. People don't know how difficult it is to go from molecule to a medicine that doesn't exist. That process is intensely capital intensive, and it takes a lot of time. So, and I'll just kind of go over some high levels here, but every new medicine, it costs about $2.6 billion to create one new medicine. It takes 12 to 15 years for that medicine to be developed. That's how long it takes to get through the FDA process. And there's a 92% failure rate. So when we get into clinical trials, 92% of the time it fails, the drug fails, and we have to start over. And so just the intensity of that drug development process is so intense. And so that is why drugs are priced the way they are, because you need to be able to not just recoup the investment, but you need to have enough money to put into R&D so that you can develop the next drug or treatment. And so that's why within America's system, we're really the only country that's still developing new treatments and drugs. It's because of the system that we have, we can derive enough revenue to pour it back into R&D to develop the next treatment. And that's something when you have a socialized medicine system, you can't derive enough revenue to be able to develop the next drug. And so you can disagree with America's system, but then the benefits are very, very clear. Like we are the ones who are developing new treatments that provide hope for a lot of patients.
Yeah, that's very incredible. And thanks for shining a light on just a very complicated system. I know we probably didn't do it justice, but even with that understanding, people, you know, they probably get bombarded with conflicting narratives online, right? And so a lot is we're being fed a lot, right? And it's conspiracies and news outlets that claim one thing to another. And so we need to have a balanced approach to truth, right? So I want to ask, how would you encourage Christians to evaluate claims online, pro or anti, when it comes to vax or drugs, pharmaceuticals, without sliding into cynicism or credulity?
Yeah, I think the key word that you used as you're conveying that question is balance. Like it's easy to get into an echo chamber. We all have tendencies to want to confirm our bias. We want to hear and read about things that confirm what we already are predisposed to believing. And so it's important to push yourself outside of the echo chamber and being able to be a student of an issue and try to listen to all sides. So that learning, I think, that learning process and how you do it becomes very, very important. Because if you are only going to one source with a bunch of people who already agree with that viewpoint, you're going to tend to go down that river. And if there's conspiracy theories that you're just predisposed to believing, like that is all you're going to see and hear if that's the only source you're going to. And so it's important to listen to differing opinions and seeing how the other side is arguing their point and really being open-minded to, hey, like, are the facts that I'm hanging my hat on real facts, or is it spin, or is it misinformation? And so I think it's important to do learning on both sides, but then also just perspective. Like, I think you need healthy biblical perspective on politics, on government, how to lead your life so that you don't slip into cynicism and get trapped into that vortex of just being so negative about everything that you're looking at. And so I think a combination of balanced learning, getting out of that echo chamber, but also having proper biblical perspective, I think helps you prevent going down that path of cynicism.
I love it. So a balanced approach to truth and the feedback that you're filtering through the prism of the Bible, right? But even with that understanding, as a believer, how do you decide when to advocate, when to abstain, and when to say, I can't support this? And what guardrails do you keep for integrity when institutional incentives push in the totally opposite direction?
I think a lot of it is in how you decide to approach an issue area. So I think a lot of it is, hey, like, have you done your homework? Have you done your research? Are you prepared to provide your perspective and then to defend it. I think you start getting into trouble is when you're not as prepared, and then you start reaching into facts that you're not sure about, that hasn't been properly vetted. And so the temptation is there all the time in order to make your arguments sound more convincing, to tell elected officials things that may not necessarily be 100% true. And it's easy to reach into that bucket because some of these policies, the impact is massive to your industry. So the stress and the pressure of wanting to either stop a threat or to pass something that's beneficial, you're constantly having that tension inside of you. And so while I want to be as impactful when I'm communicating my positions, the facts that come out of my mouth need to be credible. It needs to be properly vetted. And the temptation is to do what's convenient and to say something that supports your argument, but you may not be entirely true.
Or so perhaps omitting certain details, right?
Yeah, omitting is just as big. Yeah. And so I grapple with that all the time. I mean, even it's a big issue or small issue, you start getting into the flow. You're trying to convince the elected official, but you still want to paint the picture in a way that's accurate. And long term, if you lie, if you don't tell the truth or omit certain facts, and if that gets found out, and a lot of times it does with time, that really affects not only your testimony, but whether you can be believed every other time that you go into the office.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so that credibility is gold in our industry. You want it to the point where your reputation almost grants you that credibility. And so for me, that's always been an important thing for me to keep in mind as I'm doing my day-to-day.
Yeah.
And you have a lot of people in that room who are also listening to you. So they will know if you're purposely spinning something or omitting certain facts that are inconvenient for your argument.
Yeah, and you see that running rampant all day on the news, right? Like when you look back, a politician might say one thing, go back a few years, totally different story, right? So what you discussed, like having those guardrails are so important in your role. So more specifically, would you mind sharing an example, no names needed, but where your faith influenced or shaped how you handled a gray area decision in your current role?
Well, I think when it comes to gray area, a lot of what may be considered gray from the outside world looking in is, the political space, where we normally we'll support through ads, through mail pieces, elected officials who have had our back, who have been allies of our industry. But so that's the carrot. But once in a while, we have to bring out the stick.
Talk about that. I want to hear a little more of that.
We don't do this very often, but whenever there's an existential threat to our industry that maybe an elected official has proposed, and despite our pleading that they no longer pursue that piece of legislation, if they're insistent on pursuing it, we need to make sure not only does the elected official get the message, but their colleagues get the message where it's like, hey, if you go after us in a significant way, there can be political consequences to that. And some people see the negative side of politics where we are going negative either in ads or in mail pieces, and they're like they don't want to touch that because that feels icky. But it's the political reality. We have to play that game. Those who are on the opposite side of our industry, those who sometimes go against us, they're playing that same game. And I'm not saying like, oh, they're doing it, so we're doing it. But we, from our perspective, we need to make sure the electorate, the voters, understand what their representative is for and what they're against. And so it's my job to make sure, hey, if this elected official represents a big life sciences community where our business depends upon being able to, for example, do animal testing, but let's just say this elected official keeps pursuing legislation that would ban all animal testing, that means a lot of their constituents are going to lose their jobs if those companies can't operate in that district. And so for me, I feel like our role is to make sure voters understand and see that. And so that is where we do go negative and show that side of what they did and or their vote, and that they're not standing up for those in our industry and the workers who work in our industry. And so for us, it's part of the democratic process of making sure voters are as informed as possible when they receive their ballot. And so that is sometimes something that people have a hard time digesting, that we have to sometimes do that once in a while. But that is something that I feel like can be done correctly. Now, if you're slandering the person, making it personal, maligning their character, I think those things are not okay. That is an example.
Where it's not rooted in fact, speculation. So how do you reconcile that being a believer? That approves you within your job scope to operate a certain way?
Yeah, just making sure, hey, if we are putting out a message that it's rooted in truth, that it is something that is truly good information for the electorate to know. It's not just like a personal attack on them or making fun of them, or there's a clear line.
You're calling out hypocrisy, perhaps, right?
Yeah, where
misinformation, stuff like that. Okay.
Or like if they voted in a way where we're like, ooh, the voters should know that they voted in this way, and the public won't know it a lot of times unless we show it to them. And so I think it's part of the process that has been set up in this country. And as long as you can stay within the bounds of what is ethical, as far as your personal, there are those who do cross the line because it's politically convenient to make it personal. But for me as a believer, I want to make sure whatever we do, we're playing the game, we're playing it smartly, but we're staying within the bounds.
You're being shrewd, just like what the Bible is calling you to do. Thank you for sharing that. So I want to take that idea of influence in your sphere and apply it at a larger level, because a lot of Christians wonder, and when I say larger, I'm talking about like overall Christians here in our nation, in our state, and they might wonder, and I've heard this from my wife, like, my vote doesn't count. My voice doesn't matter. And many believers, especially in blue states like ours, California, feel like their vote doesn't matter. So what real world downstream effects do close margins have on how lawmakers govern?
Yeah, I think people tend to only want to know, hey, did we win on this issue or not?
Exactly.
Did this person get elected or not? But what elected, and I spend years working for different electeds where I'm looking at the numbers, the trends, and I think that is what a lot of Christians sometimes miss. They see the outcome and then they go, oh, and then they're immediately dismayed. But the reason why Christians should not be dismayed and continue to participate in our democratic process is if we're seeing certain trends where it's like, hey, this vote was a lot closer than we anticipated. Those are all things that creep into the psychology of any elected official. Like they're looking at it going, oh, the community, even though ultimately this issue ended up passing or winning, and maybe it's an issue that we disagree with, it was a lot closer than we expected. And so now the elected official will have to at least subconsciously or consciously think about, hey, like I can't get too far out there because the electorate is starting to slowly send a message that, hey, like you've gone too far. And so they will naturally start calibrating towards like, hey, how do I swing the pendulum back so that I'm not too disconnected from the community, because we're seeing the vote a lot closer than we had anticipated. And so that's why it's important for Christians to vote. And even if the outcome is not what they ultimately wanted, if the margins start getting closer and closer, that will help moderate politics. And maybe because of that, certain elected officials won't be as zealous to pursue certain bad policies because they're like, oh, you know what? Things are starting to trend in the other way, and they'll start moderating their beliefs or their views. And so that's why it's important for Christians to continue to stay engaged. Because if we all pull out and it's only certain people with a certain viewpoint who are voting, the elected official may be like, oh, everybody agrees with me, when that's not truly the case.
Absolutely. So every vote matters, you'd say.
Every vote matters.
And okay, for many believers, it goes even further than that, where people just look at things black and white. Oh, it didn't pass. Oh, my vote doesn't matter. How would you counsel the Christian who says government is always corrupt, or I mean, along the same lines, right?
I would say that sort of mindset is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you start thinking that way, then that is the only path that you're leaving available for government to go. And so I would encourage that person to get out of that mindset and to really put into perspective, like, who controls government? Is God in charge or not? and there may be certain elected officials who come to power that we may not agree with, but God has a reason for having established that person in that certain season. And so we need to know that, believe that, because that's what the word says. And it's our job to continue to be salt and light in this world. And so we need to continue to participate in the process. We shouldn't go back into the closet, clam up, and no longer be salt and light.
Yeah.
Romans 10, very important. Like, we need to be out there. And whether it's in your own personal walk or participating, if you clam up and say, hey, I'm going to live this isolated life in my own area where I can't be disturbed, I don't think you can fulfill what Romans 10 is charged as all Christians to be.
And I'm glad you brought up that point about being the salt and light, even in our conversations, in your role, let's say, or somebody that wants to pursue the political career. How do you do that practically without alienating those people who disagree with you on policies or politics?
Yeah, I think loving people, caring for people, I mean, that's first and foremost. People generally know when you're speaking to them out of love and when you're just speaking to them just to prove your point or to be right. And so I think at the base, like the love that God has shown you has to be reflected in your personal life. And, you know, God uses people who live their lives in a holy manner. God uses them in great ways, and it may show up differently in different venues, but your ability to be above reproach, to live in a way that reflects God's glory and his love, like that is what it all comes down to. And I feel like as long as you are doing that, you'll have opportunity to be salt and light. You'll have opportunity to share the gospel, share God's love to those who may disagree with you completely. We all have a responsibility to be salt and light, to live out our faith, to be above reproach. And if you do those things, God presents opportunities for you to share the gospel with others.
Can we go a little deeper into those opportunities? Like, what would you say, because you're in the space, what does healthy engagement look like for a believer who's never going to work in politics? If you could just say, give 3 practical actions that someone can take beyond voting.
Yeah, I think being informed about where the opportunities are to participate is important. Like at the state capitol, usually when there is a big bill that's going to be, you know, there's going to be a committee hearing on it, you have opportunity to weigh in with your representative. You can write letters, you can call, you can sign a petition. Like, these are all different venues and avenues that are built into our legislative process and our democratic process for you to be able to let your voice be heard and let your voice be known. And so there are different venues beyond voting where you can weigh in. Okay,
perfect. I love it. And so taking that further beyond voting, can you share examples, if you've seen them, where Christian participation tangibly improved a bill or blocked a harmful one, even if the final outcome wasn't everything that they wanted? Well, let's say you wanted to vote, but have you seen that in your experience?
I'm trying to think of a very specific thing, but in general, as a bill is moving through the legislative process, it's going through multiple committee hearings, it's going through multiple rounds of votes, and as it's doing that, the bill is constantly being amended. And so as people weigh in, the electorate, they're asking their elected representative to oppose something, to support something, the author of the bill will have to make adjustments and changes along the way. And so if something has started in this position, it may, by the end, be way less bad as a result of the amendments that the bill took.
And the feedback that they received from the public, correct?
That's correct.
So that's why when they say, call your assembly member, or, you know, a lot of us, we just like ignore that. I know I have, right? So is that something you'd recommend?
I do recommend that, because even when I was a staffer, whether I was a chief of staff or an intern, like every call that came through, I was recording it. And at the end of the day, I would report out to my boss, we got 32 calls on this particular issue, blah, blah, blah. And then I would have their name, their location, their address, and everything, so that we would discern, hey, who's a constituent who called, who is not a constituent, but it's still important to them. And so, like, psychologically, that all starts building, especially if it's an ongoing campaign where your phone lines are getting blown up every day. Like, that is something that we make note of. And when we have hundreds and hundreds of people who've called, I report that out to my boss. I'm like, hey, like, people are watching your vote on this. And so that will make any elected official think, because they have to face their
Of course.
community after they vote. Like, and if there's a bunch of angry people demanding answers,
well, re-election's going to come up, right?
Exactly. That's exactly right. And so that's all happening in real time in the mind of a legislator. And so that's why it's important to participate when you have the opportunity and not just think, oh, what is one phone call going to do?
Of course.
It's like, oh, it's in the aggregate. It's like, death by 1,000 cuts. Like, you have a bunch of people calling in and it feels different.
Yeah, that's actually quite encouraging. It gives me hope that involvement actually matters, right?
Yes, it does.
But with influence, I got to say, like, what I've seen, also comes misunderstanding, especially in the Christian sphere with terms like Christian nationalism that often gets tossed around, right? So how should a Christian respond to what the Bible calls us to do in light of Christian nationalism? That's one. But before we do that, can you please define that in a general sense, Christian nationalism, what it actually means, and how to separate the unhealthy versions from a biblical, faithful presence that we just talked about?
Yeah, I think Christian nationalism is such an ambiguous term, and different people define it differently. I mean, the way I view that term is using Christian moral teachings as the basis for legislation and policy. So it's really looking at these moral teachings, and you see that in a lot of the founding father, writings and documents. They did talk about sin. They did talk about human nature and what is right and wrong. They talked about God. And so using that as the basis for legislation. And now I think the foundation of our country is based on that. And there's a lot of general good that comes out of following God's design.
Right.
Whether they're doing it for the right reasons, when you follow God's design, usually there's good results because God's designed it that way. I think the danger is, so like, the gospel has always been spread through witnessing. Right. It has never expanded through government power. And so sometimes the temptation for certain Christians may be, oh, they want to do it through government. Yeah. When historically it has never been that way. That's not what Jesus was doing, not what he was teaching. It's always been through the witnessing of believers. And so that is always, I think, at the core. And we can't confuse Christian nationalism as a way to create more believers. I think there's a lot of danger in that way of thinking.
Absolutely. You can't create believers, right? Like, this is a work of God. I've read, when I was doing the research on this, just online, Google AI, just defining it, where it pushed it even further to say that many people, or some people, actually promote that our government has to be Christian in nature. And that's where I agree with you about the dangers of, artificially kind of like, it's like, I grew up in a Christian family, right? Went to church my whole life. Yeah. And to almost like where you believe early on that if I do X, Y, Z, I'm a Christian, when there was no transformation in my heart. Yeah. There's no real work. There's no real fruit. And so definitely I see the dangers of that with what you explained. Is there anything else you would add?
Yeah, so I think, like, right now, what I'm seeing right now, what's so dangerous is how secular our politics have become. Like, in the past, like, people would reference God, and whether it's coming from a place of like true faith or not, people did talk about God, what is right, what is wrong. But now politics has become so secular that it's completely godless. There's no reference to God. There's an active push to take out any removal or reference to God. And so when we read in Judges, like, everyone does what's right in their own eyes. Right. And I see that playing out, especially in the Democratic Party. I mean, it's just everybody has their truth. Everyone's encouraged to come out of the closet, do whatever. But everything except Christianity and Christian values and faith. And so that increasing secularization has led to policies and outcomes that have just devastated, I think, a lot of families, a lot of values that we've held dear is being dismantled in real time. Whether you're looking at the core nucleus of the family, the importance of having a father and mother, all those things are being now questioned, being dismantled, and the outcome of that has been, I think, very devastating for society. And so as this increasing secularization happens, I can see why for a lot of Christians, they're like, we need to go back to some of the Christian nationalism foundations, because that is where you're still you align with certain truth, with certain values that have over time shown great for society. But as that's being dismantled, that secularization has really taken a hold. And so that is, I think, the big danger right now of removing ourselves so much from what certain truths are that we've all at the foundation of this country have usually been aligned with.
Yeah. I was reading in the argument against it that they, Google AI was given is that you run the risk of supposedly discriminating against minorities. What is your take on that? Is there that risk?
Well, I think it depends on what prism you're looking through, what lens you're looking at
I
it.
see. To what extreme you're taking it.
And there's just generally, and I've noticed, like, people don't want to, like, if you're a Christian, there's this big temptation to stay in the closet, to not be open about your faith, because people don't want to be tainted as like MAGA, because everyone just assumes if you're a Christian, if you're believe in the Bible, that you're MAGA. And like in the sacramental world, like that's like the worst label to have, because then everyone's like, oh, you're a racist, you're a bigot, you don't care about women, blah, blah, blah. And so I can see that fear being spread even amongst Christians in the political world. And I think that's an unfortunate trend right now. And I do think it's important for more Christians to be in the system, to be a light, and to be out of the closet, and to be open about your faith, because I think that's how you're going to help influence certain people who are in certain positions of power who need to hear the truth.
Okay. So more of a balanced approach in light of Christian nationalism, not tend to one extreme versus the other, but basically be engaged, be informed. You also touched upon that.
And to live your life in a way that's above reproach, that you can be light.
Being that salt and light. Absolutely. Thanks for the reminder. And I appreciate the clarity here, Sam, because, that helps Christians know how to show up without falling into those extremes that we talked about. So, and the Bible gives us some incredible examples of men and women who navigated that tension. They're living in a nation completely secular, and God places them for a specific reason, and he's using them, and he gives them authority while they're in that nation. People like Daniel, Esther, Nehemiah, Joseph. Were there any that helped your own thought process on how to navigate the political arena, serving in secular power structures? And were there any lessons that translate today?
So, when I look at somebody like Esther, being a Jewish woman in Persia, but she was in a very high level in government, and she, through God's providence, was put in a very influential position. But God expects those people who are put in influential positions to make sure that, hey, that you're using your influence for God's glory and for the benefit of God's people. And so even in such a dark place, the fact that she was able to use that influential role for God's glory, that is an example of, I think, how Christians should think about their role in politics if they are given that position and that opportunity, is to use that role to influence those in a way that's going to be good for God's glory. And so I think that is an example. I mean, Daniel in Babylon, completely godless society as well, but he was a godly man, and God used him in such an influential way just because he was faithful, because he was a holy man, and that opportunity was given to him. And so I think we have to always keep that in mind in an increasingly secular society. And so God still puts Christians in influential positions to be used for his glory. And so that is something that we have to always be living in a holy way, above reproach. And that's how you are going to be salt and light, even to evil kings who have no interest in giving God glory. God will still utilize Christians to create outcomes that even the king may not have intended.
Coming down a little further here, how should Christians respond when things don't go our way, when measures, policies still pass? What's the faithful next play after a loss? How should we respond?
Yeah, and living in California, you just get your fair share of disappointment and things that pass that you don't want to pass, but we just never know. Yeah, and so it's, and you just never know, because man will create their schemes. People come up with all sorts of schemes, but ultimately the outcome is the Lord's. And so I think we need to always have a proper perspective about who's actually in charge. And we see God's providence play out. Like a lot of times we can't see it in the moment, but we look back and see, oh, this is what God was doing. And so I think having that proper perspective, and then just being encouraged that, hey, God ultimately is sovereign and in control, and seeing, hey, how else can we influence or impact the outcome of the next battle? And so there's always going to be another something, but like the best thing we can do is continue to live faithfully, to be salt and light, and let God take care of the things that, the outcome of things. And so I think that's where we can be best utilized and positioned in our political process.
Absolutely. And I love how you brought it back to not being discouraged. I love that grounded perspective, Sam, and that actually lines up beautifully with Hebrews 10:24, which is the anchor of our show. And in that verse, we're called to consider how to spur one another towards love and good works. So in politics, what do love and good works look like in concrete policy behavior? And where have you seen believers model that? Courage, humility, truth, even in the Capitol?
Yeah, I've been very encouraged by the men and women who are believers in the Capitol. Like we've identified those who are in the same camp, have the same belief. And there's actually a Capitol ministry led by a pastor. His name is Frank Erb, who's been very encouraging to so many people, not just those believers, but even elected officials. They're all humans, and they all will go through things in their lives. And Republican or Democrat, they will, in those moments of vulnerability, reach out to Pastor Frank Erb and seek his counsel, seek the truth. And so as believers, like that's always encouraging, knowing who the other workers are in the field and being able to stay connected with them. We, meet for Bible studies. We meet for just discussing, books that we're reading through. And it gives you another co-laborer that you can be encouraged by and be an encouragement to. And so God is working. You see believers like continuing to be funneled into the Capitol community. And those are great opportunities to watch them and to be an encouragement to them to continue the fight. And it's amazing how God will continue to put believers in certain positions to help influence elected officials and other stakeholders in the system and influence them in a way that's going to either bring salvation into their lives or help them to think about, hey, like what is the moral right or wrong thing to do here? And so those are the types of things that excite me. There are believers in the Capitol community, and it's amazing to see how God will work through individuals to help influence people.
Absolutely. That's super encouraging to even, hear that you guys have that. Maybe some people just view politics as this godless thing, but you see that there are believers that are out there on the front lines, and they go as far and maybe even further than some of us, where they actually are intentional in their day to gather to talk about their faith. That's cool.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Like this is the middle of the day probably, right? Or in the morning.
Yeah. Sometimes we'll get together before the day starts in the morning, or sometimes there's like a lunch gathering, but a lot of times we'll get together early in the morning just to pray for each other and to share whatever struggles we're going through in our own personal capacities at work.
That's super encouraging.
But it's always great looking at another fellow believer and being able to, shake hands and hug each other and just encourage each other.
It goes beyond just like networking, right? You're part of the same body of Christ, universal church, and that connects you on such a deeper level. I love it. That's so cool. So before we close the door on Christian nationalism, I know we could probably do a whole separate podcast on that alone, just Christian nationalism, and just address all the different sides, extremes, what that balance looks like practically. Is there anything you feel is worth discussing that you would want to hit on?
I think sometimes like people have dogmatic views on Christian nationalism, and depending on what camp you're in, but I just keep going back to, like, if people are living in a manner that is above reproach, like that is like truly in any workplace, whether it's in the halls of the Capitol or, out in the fields, like I can't emphasize enough, like that's what it comes down to, more so than, hey, we need to pass certain policies, or like that's where like the gravitational pull is all about, policy outcomes.
Yeah.
But that is not, from my view, the way like a nation is going to be, experiencing a revival or anything like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like for me, putting all, and sometimes Christians do this, is put so many eggs in the government basket when
Right.
it's not going to be the vehicle that is going to be changing the culture or
Yeah.
anything like that. And so it still comes down to individuals living an upright life, being a good witness to their neighbors, being in the community, showing love, caring for people. Like that is ultimately what will move the needle, not so much, hey, we need to pass a certain law in order to, change certain things. Like that to me is not the mechanism. And throughout history, that hasn't been the mechanism. And so just
Right.
being very aware of that, I think is important.
Yeah. And, I've listened to a few podcasts on Christian nationalism, and, to your point, like a lot of people define it in their own way.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, you realize that government by itself will never be perfect because only God's government is perfect.
Correct.
There's no earthly government that will ever reach that perfection. As hard as, socialists try to claim that it's perfect utopia that they're trying to reach, it will never be perfect because we are sinners, we're wicked, and we're deceitful, right? Scripture tells us that the heart is evil.
Yeah.
Our best deeds are like rags. And so when you look at that, you're like, no, absolutely not. Like, yeah, we live in this world. We're called to be smart. We're called to be shrewd, innocent like doves. And yet we have to realize that government will not save.
Yeah.
Only Christ saves.
And that's a key point. That's a key point. And as Christians, that's why we don't lose hope. We don't look at the news and like get into dismay. Like those things like will come and go, but it doesn't change anything for believers and how we live our day to day.
Absolutely. And yet, when we see these examples of Daniel, Esther, Paul, we're still called to just be engaged, be informed, and I love that. So it's like a double-edged sword. We understand this, and yet we're called to be responsible.
Yes, great point.
Yeah.
Yep.
So basically, getting to our last couple questions here, how can we disagree without disdain and keep doors open for gospel in polarized conversations? How do you do that? And how would you encourage believers? Like, I mean, let's say hypothetical situation, but let's say there's just somebody that really, not the person, but just the topic just rubs you the wrong way. How would you go about disagreeing without disdain?
Yeah, I mean, and that happens pretty often where like somebody is saying something about your industry that, because, and it's hard not to take it personal because like you live and breathe that industry as a lobbyist. But I think the important thing is to back up and have perspective on like, hey, what's most important? Is this person's opinion matter so much that you're willing to compromise your conduct, the way you should be loving others? Like, is it affecting that? And so for me, a lot of it is just, I have to do the things in the morning to make sure my perspective is God-centered, so that, hey, like when I'm out in the field, if I'm in the mindset of, hey, I'm looking for opportunities to share and show God's love, then like those things that other people say, you don't take it as personally, because there's like that thing in the back of your head that goes, you know what, like this is an opportunity. They may care about your faith down the line, and you never want to be in a position where you have said something or treated somebody a certain way, and then they later find out you're a Christian,
right?
And then at that point, you're almost dead in the water. It's like why would they ever want to be attracted to your God if you've treated them a certain way or haven't shown the love? And so that's always like the proper, to me, like the perspective to make sure you're not so offended by worldly things. It's like at the end of the day, they can say whatever they want about you, and it's usually about your industry. So it's like, why are you even taking it so personally? But like, it's always like hey, like I care about this person's soul more than whatever they may be saying about your industry that you disagree with.
Right. And I love how you brought it back to the gospel, essentially. Like, how does our life at the end of the day exemplify or testify to the gospel when people actually find out, like, hey, oh, you're a Christian? Wow. When the world knows that in general, we're called to a greater standard.
Right.
So just, I love how you brought that back. And just a key point that I took away is that disagreeing with grace is one of the most powerful witnesses that we have, right?
Yeah.
So our words can either close doors or keep them open for the gospel to be used, just like you explained in your other example with the journalist or columnist, right?
Yeah.
So this kind of brings me to my last one that I asked from the heart of this podcast. If you had 2 minutes to speak directly to the church about public life, what would you ask us to stop doing, start doing, and keep doing?
Yeah. I think there's a tendency sometimes to be overly pessimistic, to put yourself in this corner where you're like, nothing good can happen out of government or politics. I think that sort of mindset, I think, is not helpful. I think as Christians, we always know where to put our hope, and we trust in God's sovereignty. We trust in his providence, and we do our part. We do our best and leave the outcome, like every elected leader is directly from the Lord's hands. And so knowing that he controls the hearts of kings, like we continue to do our part, knowing that God's going to bring to fruition exactly what he intended. And so as believers, I think we have to get away from the pessimism. It doesn't mean we're naive. And so we got to participate, we got to do our part, but don't look at a single outcome and be like, this is the reason why I don't participate, I don't vote. Like those things, I think, are not the way to be approaching politics. We should be encouraged that God is ultimately in control, and we know what our part is as individuals in the process.
I love it. So for everyone listening, if this is something that you guys are intrigued by, I just want to encourage you guys to pursue that, because I think the extreme would be, like we discussed, to be like, oh no, this is godless, right? But like you can take that to an extreme in so many different other, fields, perhaps, right? Just by looking at the negatives.
Right.
And not to say that we will redeem government for Christ, because of the things we talked about, but just want to encourage you guys that God can use you guys, right? Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely.
I mean, he's using you, Sam. That's incredible.
Yeah.
I love it.
Of all people, I mean, if he knew,
I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't go that far.
But God puts people in certain positions, and so, it's your job to make the most of it, and to not despair, not to be pessimistic, but to be encouraged by where the Lord has taken you, and just continuing to be faithful. And God uses, and I've seen this over and over again, those who live their lives in a holy manner, like the way God uses those people is incredible, whether it's in politics or outside of politics. So that's something that we all need to keep in mind.
I love it. And I love the challenge you've given us throughout this podcast, that we shouldn't let frustration turn into apathy, right?
Correct.
So guys, very simply put, like what Sam's been preaching to us or speaking to us about, just be engaged, vote, serve, speak life, and of course, pray for our government leaders, right? The Bible encourages us to pray for our government leaders and people like Sam, who are faithfully serving on the front lines of the political sphere. So, Sam, we're going to be praying for you, man, that God would use you mightily in the space that you're working in. And Hebrews 10:24 says, let us consider how we may spur on one another towards love and good works. So, guys, even if you're not directly engaged in civil service, know that you and I can still be used for the Lord, because influence begins with faithfulness. Anything else you'd like to add before we kind of wrap this thing up?
No, that was a great, perfect way to end it. Perfect note, perfect message.
If this podcast was in any way encouraging or caused you to reflect and feel challenged in your worldview, perhaps even challenged to make some healthy changes in the way that you engage with your local government officials, your assembly members, the policies that come out, right? If this podcast was encouraging, the best way you can support us is to like, share, and subscribe, of course, with your friends and family. Thanks for tuning in. Stay encouraged, stay faithful, and of course, stay Eddiefied.
Let's go. I love it.
All right, guys.